Some stories inspire beauty. Some inspire passion. Yet others stir up within us passions for other things. Love, fame, adventure. But what of stories which delve into deeper, darker waters? Do they not also move us just as readily? Tales of mystery, conspiracy, tales of woe and pain, of things which are worse than pain, worse than woe, worse than death. The presentation that is to follow is of the latter set, the set that is rife with shadow. The patinas of lichen and rust can plainly be seen in the corner of one's eye. Any rainbows here are illusory. We are far now from anywhere that you may be calm nor at ease. We are alone in the dark, so that the light and noise of day will not distract us from this which we intend to discuss. The time I died again. It was probably around 9:30 in the morning when my back started bothering me. I paid the irritation little mind and went on with my day. These minor aches were common enough. Sleeping on a nylon military cot was likely to blame, and my increasingly middled age, no doubt, was not uncomplicating this. No, the discomfort would have to be ignored for the time being. I was being paid to aid in the project, not to curl up with a blankie. A coffee, a smoke, and back to work. Quitting time ain't till 4. A couple of the cool kids from my team invited me for lunch. I'd been plugging away all morning. A nice hot lunch with pals seemed exactly the thing to set up for the rest of the day. The 5 of us fit into 2 cars and headed across town to a spot we could all agree on. We sat and ordered, but all the while that persistent ache in my back was getting worse. In the few minutes we'd been sat in the booth, that ache had developed into a twinge. I was having a hard time even just sitting there. I excused myself to the washroom. I've never been one to advertise my pain, not wishing it to be the impetus for another's sympathy or deference. Like a wounded cat crawling underneath the house to be alone, I intended to return after the current swell subsided. Rather than passing, the ache grew worse. I was sure I wouldn't be able to finish the day. I asked the friend who rode in my car if she would drive me back to the office. I explained the pain I was feeling. I wanted to go back and lay down in one of the conference rooms or vacant offices until I felt well enough to drive myself home. We'd almost made it out of the parking lot before I had to stop her. The pain was terrible. It was clear that I needed the one thing that I hoped I didn't need the most: an ambulance. She called at once. The ambulance was fast. The pain was faster. In the few brief moments between the call and their arrival, that bothersome twinge had become a driving, stabbing agony. The RCTs confirmed what I'd already suspected. Perhaps a week before, or that morning around 9:30, the soft interior lining of my aorta rifted and unraveled in a gradual spiral from the top of the arch, past the junction, feeding blood to my kidneys, and into one of my legs. Had the outer layers of tissue also given way, I would have bled into my own chest cavity, lifeless and void, in around half a minute. I was quite literally micrometers from death. The diagnosis was a type B aortic dissection, or, more generally, aortic dissection. In most patients, this sort of trauma, although serious, is manageable with medication and extended rest, and giving the tissue time to mend naturally on its own. Having grown up with a degenerative connective tissues disorder, the common and oft sufficient protocol was not effective. This fact had become increasingly apparent as the weeks gave way to months, and subsequent imaging showed little improvement. The need for surgical intervention had in turn become apparent. Appointments were set, arrangements were made, logistics were resolved. I arrived at the hospital hours before dawn. I was given a gown. My personal effects were collected and catalogued. The first of a series of IVs was inserted into my arm. I stole one last hug from my aunt before I was shown to a gurney. A porter wheeled me through twisting corridors as an anesthesiologist walked alongside and went over his preoperative checklist with me. Once I arrived in the OR, I was greeted by my surgeon and his assisting army of doctors and nurses. The anesthesiologist affixed a mask to my face and instructed me to breathe deeply, counting backward from 100. I remember nothing past 99. Appalachian music rang out softly in the air. There was no specific source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from nowhere, yet everywhere all at once. Light faded back in after what seemed like days. I found myself floating, drifting above the forest of trees, bathed in sepia-tinged evening sunlight. As I floated over the treetops, voices became apparent. They were calm, masculine, and accented in a rural cadence. The exact words are lost to me. I drifted south. Moving closer, I could finally identify the source of this exchange. I saw two men, middle-aged and bearded. They were dressed in clothing not unlike you would expect to see on a fisherman or huntsman. Not waders, tackle, or camouflage, but denim, leather, and tractor caps. Their faces were weathered and rough, like they'd seen more hard days than most. They did not see me moving. They didn't see me hovering near them. Instead, they saw another man, this one younger, perhaps early 30s, and clean-shaven. He was loading lumber and bricks into the back of his pickup through the hatch of its topper. The first two men approached him slowly, barking their disapproval at him and spitting at the ground. They were angry. He was the target of their anger.
"I thought I told you to keep away from here, boy,"
he said. He circled around the stranger.
"Yeah, didn't we tell your sissy ass to stay the hell out of these woods?"
asked the other, circling around the other side of him. The stranger turned pale. His expression was the same as it probably would have been had his mother walked in on him pleasing himself in her dressing gown.
"And here you are. Must be seeking for trouble."
A shove from one.
"Is that right, boy? You looking for trouble?"
A nudge from the other.
"We don't like you. What do we say would happen if we saw you around here again?"
The younger man quickly rounded the truck and sped off, leaving his materials behind. The older men ran to their own truck and set off through the trees after him. My vision slowly lifted away from that scene. As the truck sped off, banjo and fiddle music echoed through the sky. The moment had all the feel of the end of an episode of some low-budget dramatic sitcom, but dark and not funny. The music faded, as did any light. It remained silent and black for some time. I woke in a hospital bed. I was restrained and intubated. I was in a recovery ward in my own room, lined with cabinets and machines. I couldn't move beyond what my restraints allowed, but I was calm. It was over. A nurse came in soon after. He was a soft-looking, healthy man, light skin, short, dark hair, and glasses. He was dressed in dark blue scrubs with a similarly colored shirt underneath, all over a white thermal shirt. In one hand, he held a clipboard, and the other a pen. He used the latter to point to his name tag as he introduced himself.
"My name's Joshua,"
he said.
"Call me Josh. Do you know where you are?"
I nodded. I was in the hospital. I'd survived. I was relieved. Joshua saw the relief on my face and smiled.
"You're going to be okay. Just rest, and we'll see what we can do about getting that tube out.
I smiled what I was sure was a grotesque smile and nodded again. I slowly closed and opened my eyes as I did in gratitude. He smiled and left the room. and I fell asleep shortly after. I woke again. This time, the room was darker. There was a blue hue to the light, sapping out most other color. Other scrubs were around, busy in their doings. They looked irritated and spoke instructions to each other sharply. Another nurse entered and asked if I felt okay. I nodded and blinked as before, lacking any other ability to communicate. He told me that he was going to remove my breathing tube. As soon as I gave the established affirmation, he began to pull, hand over hand, drawing out slick yellow sputum and mucus as it went. I drew a dry breath and then immediately thanked him.
Where's Josh?
My voice was dry. Save your voice. He left for the day. I'm Matt. I'll take care of you. He spoke curtly in a harsh tone. He sounded as irritated as the others dancing around us. Can you tell me your name? I gave it. Do you know your birthday? I stated it. Do you know where you are? I gave the name of the hospital. Do you know why you're here? I answered accordingly. As this exchange took place, I felt an odd sensation, movement under the blankets near my feet. A cord-like shape pressed against my ankle and then it coiled around it. It was heavy and tightened down on my leg like a snake or the slick-ribbed tendril of an eldritch god. Darkness came again, and my calm was broken, perturbed by a notion that something was amiss. When darkness withdrew, I was in a corridor. People of unnatural shape and color were buzzing up and down along with a handful of average-looking people with normal proportions and dress. On seeing me, one approached me and ushered me into a sort of cubicle along the wall of an adjacent hall. She was blue, with 2 blue swooshes where her hair could have been, like some kind of bifurcated Smurf hat, which grew directly out of her head. She was wearing a red leather zip front jacket which hugged her body perfectly. It was textured in a serpent skin pattern with a glossy yellow stripe along each arm. She smiled at me with black lips and perfect white teeth. Welcome. She was chipper and sweet. Her voice was perfect, almost angelic. Orientation here is almost non-existent, so I think I'll have you just jump in. She sat me at a terminal in one corner of the cubicle and bade me to begin. At no point did I question her. It didn't even occur to me to do so. I went on about my tasks as if they were normal, familiar, and natural. The task itself was strange, but I engaged anyway. Listed on my terminal screen were a series of names. Each name had a handful of information next to it. My task was to select each name and process the associated file. For each, there were a series of sorting criteria and options. I opened one, examined it, selected an option that seemed to fit, but the criteria were odd. I was being tasked to examine each individual record. Alongside each were displayed a series of crimes and misdeeds. Under each entry were shown a corresponding batch of penalties. The task was to categorize each offense and apply the correct penalty. I processed name after name, judging the listed offenses based on vaguely outlined parameters. Of course, it wasn't long before it occurred to me that the names displayed could well be those of real people with real lives, passions, merits, and flaws. As soon as I realized this, I felt awful. Who was I to judge the actions of others? By what authority was I to assign punishment? I looked up from my terminal and saw the blue woman staring back at me. She lifted her head in laughter, and the darkness returned. I was bound in my room again. The tube was back in. The tendrils were wrapped around both ankles now and tugging. They felt like 2 tapered worms wriggling at my feet. Matt hissed.
Can you tell me your name?
I scowled.
Do you know where you are?
Yes, I thought. I know.
Do you know why you're here?
He smiled.
Feel better? I'll come back in a little bit and see if we can get that tube out of you.
By then I knew for sure I hadn't made it after all. I died on that table, and had no idea how long since it had been. I found myself standing in a warehouse late at night. It was a sprawling industrial space, well lit inside and out. At first I was alone, but I was soon joined by a young woman, early to mid-20s, brunette, dressed in plaid, flannel, and jeans. She approached me angrily.
"Who do you think you are?"
she asked.
"Sorry?"
I was confused. I didn't know who she was or what had prompted her to approach me in the first place.
"Why did you have my boyfriend tortured?"
"You're who?" I looked over her shoulder to a young man about her age. He was wearing a similar outfit, but his flannel was unbuttoned. He scowled at me from the other side of an open door.
"Because of you, he was tied up and beat. How could you do that? Who do you think you are?"
At first I was confused. Had it something to do with that damned terminal in the corridor? I walked away, angry and ashamed, and tried to put her out of my mind. But although I was able to put her quickly behind me, I couldn't put out the idea that I'd been somehow responsible for actions I wasn't even clear I was taking. I had sentenced him from my terminal in the corridor cubicle without even having seen his face. Just a jumble of letters on a screen. I felt manipulated and used, but simultaneously felt guilt. Her attack wasn't the reason for my shame. At the time, I felt I was doing what was expected of me. I hadn't even been fully cognizant of the gravitas of my actions, yet as a result, another suffered. It could be said that he may have done some awful things in his life. I could then argue a stance that whatever he got may have been deserved and therefore just. What I could not accept is the notion that it was my place to assign that punishment. I didn't know him. I didn't even remember what he'd supposedly done to be cast along with us into the dark. I spent the next several days, I say days, time, although linear, was not otherwise definitive. Events collided as dominoes, one followed another, but the length of time was unclear. Days passed in instants, whilst seconds dragged for hours, both at once. I lacked sufficient language to express what it felt like, but this, apparently, was the absurd nature of time in the Underdark. I went on to experience still more similarly Stygian vignettes. They ranged from calm scenes with pendulous undertones to all-out gang wars. Most took place at night. Most were chaotic and overwhelming. The common thread through them all was an ever-present sense of hopelessness, helplessness. At the onset of each encounter, I felt I wanted no part, but found myself in the middle of things nonetheless. Circumstances, situations, and civilizations were paraded before me, or rather, I was paraded through them. I would find myself in a place. I would come to a sense of that place. A thing would occur. I would interact with that thing. I would discover a task, usually one which is set up to produce an unfavorable outcome, then be tasked to perform that action. I would then be ridiculed in some way for my inability to perform an action which was not likely to be achievable in the first place. The nurses rolled my gurney down a hallway. I was ushered into a small, square room and left alone there. In the room were two pods. They were brushed metal, accented by wood trim. They were round and modern-looking. The room itself was similarly schemed in metal and wood, with rounded corners between the walls, ceiling, and floor. It was comfortably lit from above and quiet. This was the first moment of calm I had felt since the realization that I had become deceased. A quiet hiss of air broke the silence, and the lid of the left pod opened. Fog and tiny crystals of ice fell from the top as it did. My late uncle rose from the pod and smiled at me with affection. He greeted me and then promptly told me that I needed to go to the next room. I asked where he'd been, but he said he could not answer. I asked if I could go back with him instead, but he likewise replied in the negative. "You can't go where I am, and I can't talk to you about it, but you do need to go." He returned to his pod and the door closed. Blinding light seemed to shine through the cracks just as the door closed to block it. I remember a dream I'd had years before any of this. A bit of background here. The dream had been about my father. He'd passed away when I was very young. My uncle, his brother, had helped raise me after his death. I found peace with his death, but I've missed him all along the way. In the dream, Dad burst into my apartment and told me he needed my help with some nebulous task. I jumped to action and followed him. Along the way I told him I miss and love him. He said that he knew, but he wasn't allowed to reply. Similarly, when I asked where he'd been, or if he would stay, he said he couldn't say where, and that he would have to leave again after we were finished. He could never see me again, ever. What my uncle had said in that wood and metal room was like an echo of that dream, the familiarity of it. My thoughts were interrupted by a deep voice calling from behind. I faced the doorway and saw a black figure, bathed in even blacker smoke. His features were not static. Out of one eye, he looked like a helmeted knight, caped in fur. Out of the other, he was a beast, like an ebon minotaur from the legend of Theseus. Out of both, two red eyes stared back, glowing dimly but not clearly from an incomprehensible darkness. I knew his name. He was the beast himself, Yaltabat, Abaddon, Satanus Incarnatus, the god of light, Lucifer, the demiurge. He acted as bailiff and escorted me into a long, gray, rectangular room. At the back, a dozen black-robed figures with grotesque faces followed me with their eyes from rows of benches. At the front of the room were several pairs of Nile creatures, 2 crocodiles, 2 wild dogs, 2 ibises, scarabs, cats. But they were not solid. They were composed of a 3-dimensional grid of blue points of light, like glass bubblegrams, but without glass to suspend them. Yet they were somehow animate, moving their heads and appendages only slightly, so as to remain in their formation. In the left-hand corner was an amorphous mass. It was there, yet not there, always in the corner of my eye, and in the corner of the room, no matter where I looked, except when I tried to look directly at it. Somehow I sensed that it was a she. This was somewhat confirmed when I thought I saw a female form fade in and out of view within the shapeless cloud. Her face and hands were alabaster white. Her long hair was black, as were her clothes, though her garment was seamless, and as amorphous as the haze as she was made of. She was there, but not there, shapely yet formless, and without asking, I knew her name too. She was the Sophia. And the beast spoke. His voice boomed throughout the chamber as if amplified from every direction.
You have been brought here before she that created all things. You will be judged, and you will be found unworthy of her.
She spoke next, but her words were incomprehensible. There was a feminine quality to her voice, but the sounds were unlike any human language. Her voice was ethereal, angelic and demonic. It was distorted, almost digital. I told the beast that I did not understand.
You will only speak to answer our questions. Who are you to dare to comprehend her? You are a mayfly in her eyes. She is timeless and everything.
He addressed her then in the same manner in which she spoke. His chaotic words were indecipherable in my ears. She replied, and an exchange took place, in spite of me. Only in my arrogant imagination could I have hoped to grasp their meaning. After, he addressed me again.
You will now be given an opportunity to demonstrate your subservience to her, that she may have reason for mercy, not cast you into the dark.
He pointed at one of the animals on the wall.
Prove to her that you love her. Kill one.
I recognized the significance of the situation and recognized the agents. The myth involves the one god having created for himself a realm in which to dwell. In the creation of his heavenly realm, he employed a host of ethers which carried out the labor in constructing what he had conceived in his mind. One of these elemental beings, acting in accordance with her function, continued to toil after completing the heavenly realm. Unaware she had completed her task, she continued to spin. According to a few versions of this tradition, when the one God created heaven, he created all that was necessary to build, the pure and impure alike. He deemed what was good suitable for him, and cast the remainder aside. But there were all these bricks left over. It was pursuant to her nature. She was a creative genitive force. She was literally created by God to create. she continued to weave. From the leftover, crude, impure detritus of the birth of heaven, she knitted a sky, and placed within that sky a world to turn, and placed a sun and moon above that world, and created a host of creatures to worship the one God, as she was created by God to do. But she had spun her world from the impurities. Her creation was flawed. Her creatures began revering her world instead of the one God. This world, the entire earth, and all the creatures in it. In these traditions, it is stated that the ether was pleased by the approval that her creation gave her world. When God asked what she was doing, she tried to hide her flawed creation from him. She created Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, to be her representative, executor, proxy, as the situation called. He was the devil cast out by God, and the one pretending to be God, that we think is God, because that is exactly what she wants you to think, because it keeps you separate from God. Odin, Marduk, Jupiter, Shiva, Atum-Ra, Yahweh, Allah, all faces of the beast. All faces of the beast. We are far from God here. So then was it true? I hesitated. The beast insisted. He bade me to do it and do it quick. I understood the test. Embrace her and become a demon. Refuse her and depart from her into endless suffering. I chose. I didn't want to become an implement for her to use. I already had a pretty low opinion of the ethical attitudes she had displayed thus far. But to be pushed into darkness, I had no idea how deep it was. Just how bleak it could have been. I struck a cat hung there on the wall. It recoiled and twitched in surprise. Its blue dots of light turned red and then fell. The tiny red orbs bounced off the floor in arcs like slag off a foundry floor, then faded to nothing. The beast laughed.
All for nothing. She sees your heart. You hesitated. You are not worthy of her. You are not worthy of yourself, which she has given you. See, here, you have ended this creature, and gained by it nothing. You will be cast out again.
Her voice returned, but it was not words she spoke, it was laughter. It was distorted as before, but she was clearly laughing. The grotesque figures in the back of me joined in. Once again, I was blinded by darkness and deafened by silence. I was nowhere, forgotten. Please. Hello? Is there anybody listening? Can anyone show me a way out of this place? Anyone? The silence hung for some time. On the other side of the portal, I found myself at the foot of a long table in a large glass and metal conference room. It was a cathedral of a room. The walls on the left and right were dark racing green. High, tiny, circular windows were placed all along them, ringed in brass frames. The entire far wall itself was a gigantic picture window, framing an unfamiliar nighttime cityscape. Out at a shallow sea of buildings were in foreground. A high hill punctuated the left corner of the view. The hill was crowned by an unlit ruin of some forgotten keep. Within the high room were a half-dozen people, mostly men, and all dressed professionally. They were stood about the large boardroom table. I rounded the left side of it. The chairman addressed me when I was near. He was a pink man, average build, short white hair neatly wrapped around a broad patch of bald.
We see you found our door.
That round hatch? Yeah, where does it go?
It leads exactly where you need to be.
Where I need to be? Where do I need to be?
The door opens to what you truly need.
What do I need? Who are you people?
We are the hospital board. It is our responsibility to oversee the proper and effective treatment of all our patients.
Spirits? Demons? Here? Where? What, what hospital?
You will limit all inquiries to your treatment. This is our only priority.
Fine. What's on the other side of the hatch?
Nothing. Everything. That door is a portal to exactly what you need. So, the question here is, what exactly do you need? What are your treatment goals?
My treatment goals? What are you talking about? I don't need any treatment. I'm not alive.
Then why are you in a hospital?
I don't really think I am, and I'm pretty sure that you know I'm not.
You've suffered a severe trauma. To release you in your current condition would be incredibly negligent on our part. We couldn't possibly grant you a discharge. But let me ask you this. During your stay at our fine treatment facility, what could our friendly staff do to make you comfortable?
I already told you, you can't heal the dead. So let me go. I am dead. Let me be dead. Let me be. Let me not be. The chairman raised his eyebrows high and sighed.
We simply can't let you go if you still need treatment. But there may be something.
He rubbed the corner of his chin with a single index finger.
There is oblivion.
He leaned forward.
It's a rash treatment, but if it's the only thing that's effective...
Oblivion?
Well, given your current health, the Dean of Medicine would never agree to sign off on your discharge. Oh no, that would be quite negligent. Quite negligent indeed. Imagine the legals. The hospital's reputation is at stake. But we could sort of suspend you. It's sort of like stasis. You won't even realize you're here.
So what was this? Another trick? Another trap? A wink at an end? I couldn't be sure, but one thing was certain. More of the same of this was intolerable. I nibbled. So, I asked, what do I have to do?
Just go through the hatch.
That's it?
That's it. The door leads wherever you need to go. You will know the way once it's open. We'll have a clerk file the appropriate paperwork.
What have I got to lose, right? I shrugged and turned to the exit of the conference room. The hall was empty. Matthew and his orderly were gone. I crossed the portal. Twisting the dial to the right did nothing. After a few anti-clockwise rotations, a dull thump struck from within the door itself, and the handle dropped a few degrees. I grasped the metal handle and gave it a final twist. It gave. The hatch opened. The heavy, hollow hum of metal rang out as it slid out towards me. The hum faded seconds after the door lost contact with its jamb. The armature that joined it to its hinge articulated silently as the hatch swung agape. Within were only chaos and light. Beyond that metal door, there was no metal door. There was only the vortex, the eye of an endless maelstrom spinning anti-clockwise around a void. The wreath of wind had the look of sand whipping around a sea of soft white light. At its heart was a rounded rectangular slab of beige stone. The slab was troughed from end to end in both directions, creating a cross-shaped trench in the middle of 4 plateaus. Where the 2 troughs crossed, a circular pit descended to some unknown blackness. Suspended above the pit was a man, each limb tied to one of the 4 corners. His hair and beard were long and flipped about in the swirling wind. He was naked and screaming. His eyes first closed, then opened wide as if to express some shock. Still screaming, he looked at me.
Have you come to let me go?
He yelled. The cacophony of the grinding sand and howling wind mostly covered his voice, but I understood him.
Please, untie me. I can't stand another hour. It's been so long.
He wept. What do you mean? I shouted back. How long? Who put you here?
Ages.
He panted loudly.
I don't know who anymore.
Without even a thought, I untied his limbs, one by one, starting at his feet. He cowered there and looking down into it said,
The back door of the universe.
I looked down in the endless shaft.
The containers of chaos.
He looked back at me with a placid but grateful expression.
Thank you.
Then I was naked in his place, bound and spread and suspended flat above that black shaft. The man was gone. So was time. How many words should one devote to describe nothing, in a place where time does not exist and the only object is a stone altar to the devil's rectum? I don't remember a long stretch of absolutely the same bit of nothing going on forever. I don't even really remember anything after being suspended over the pit. Honestly, I don't remember being anchored there, just having been anchored. Then nothing. And when I say nothing, I mean nothing. No blackness, no silence, no pain, no time, nothing. Then I was suspended above the pit. Frankly, there was no perceptible difference between before oblivion and after, except for a distinct notion that I had not existed for a very long time. How long, of course, I couldn't say, but perhaps long enough to have an impact on the passage of time back in the living world, whatever that was. Perhaps days had passed, maybe generations, empires, eons, worlds. There was no way to know. If I continued to pass time in oblivion, I wouldn't be escaping. I would be forcing myself further and further away from worldly things and everything that would be familiar to me. The stone block was gone, and then I was someone else. I was a young tech kid working in a quaint brick and glass rotunda converted into an office. Different face, different name, different clothes, different life. It had been 50 years or more since I had been alive. The world had changed in varying ways, but up until that instant, I had not been aware because I existed then. My childhood and youth had been there in that flat home, with those parents and that sister. He didn't even remember having been me a half-century ago. He had only known himself as himself. Suddenly, a broken set of vague memories were returning to him. He struggled to imagine me in the context of my time, but he couldn't. I couldn't. But then I could. Over the next minutes, I began unfolding the memories of the old me again. Something had triggered them. What had it been? The package delivery driver that smiled and waved. There was something familiar about her. What had it been? I had never seen her in my life and didn't speak to her at all when she brought the package. But I knew her name was... and I knew her mom was... I spun around to find her, but by the time I realized who she was, she'd gone. She was my cousin. Not my cousin. His cousin. The dead guy's. New me didn't believe in ghosts. New me didn't give reincarnation any thought. New me was a secular rationalist that liked to write algorithms. Past life flashbacks were strange enough, but ghosts from 5 decades ago, delivering packages, were even stranger. Perhaps I was tired and got sleepy in the afternoon rain, and my imagination was drifting, laying things over top of my waking thoughts. I rose and fixed a cup of coffee. With a steaming cup of hot life, I returned to my desk, facing the rotunda window. Beyond the glass, my cousin smiled and waved from outside. "You need to come back, Nick. None of this is real. You aren't him. You're my cousin and our friend, and we love you. What is happening around you is a lie. They're trying to confuse you." Her voice was muted and buzzed through the glass, but I understood her words. "Who's trying? What's going on? Who else is..." And then I was me again. Tech Kid was the one who had never existed. I was me, curled into a ball on my right side, naked on the floor in the dark. Soft blue light, cast from nowhere, bathed me just enough to see, but beyond me there was nothing but impenetrable black. This is the part of the film where the audio engineer mutes the sound over the action taking place on the screen, and a set of short vignettes ensues to push the narrative along and bridge the gap between the second and third acts. In this case, we'll apply something familiar. Late 70s British invasion rock, maybe early Zeppelin, but no Stairway. It's hard to sum up what seemed like eons. So many scenes ensued. I ran from inquisitors armed with automatic weapons in the desert. I was teased with potential reincarnations, each more unpleasant than the last. I have since forgot so many of the lives I tasted, yet so many remain. I lived in a vault underground hundreds of years after the world ended. I visited a sort of afterlife spaceport where beings of all descriptions were queued to see the breadth of cosmos and the endless variety that could be experienced. Through the entire thread of events I was tested. Sometimes I failed and I was ridiculed. Occasionally I would pass, only to be thrust into another puzzle. But whilst these scenarios played out, I was starting to piece the world together. Through the scenes and patterns they betrayed, I began to suss out just how this house of mirrors functioned. I couldn't in any way predict what horrid circumstances I would find myself in each new scenario, but I had seen enough of each to piece together the rules. I was dead. Of that I was fairly certain. Even if I wasn't, this was no dream. When I dream, I can't help but wake up, merely at the notion that I might be dreaming. Without fail, the instant I question if I am dreaming, I am thrust into wakefulness. The dream is gone. The magic it had is broken. This time the thought could not rouse me. This was something beyond the wall of sleep. Further, I had noticed that I could not feel agony. I knew kinetic sensation, the tile cold against the bottoms of my feet, the air whirling about me, those damned tendrils caressing my ankles, even now. But nor did I feel hunger, nor thirst, nor any other thing that was not specific to the story I was placed within. More interesting to me, I was beginning to see through the interactions that I had with my demonic tormentors, that my words within them had certain power. It was limited, be sure, but some things I said seemed to have weight. I could refuse. Even if I could not escape from the scene that held me, I found that I could choose to not comply. I couldn't lose if I refused to play. This seemed to frustrate my captors. They scolded me and went through the motions of punishing me over and over, but I did not relent. I didn't directly retaliate. I remained stoic and calm, and why not? I wasn't in pain. I wasn't hungry. No drink nor potion brought me any joy or relief. After these, what was left to fear? The horror? My most beloved dreams in life were often dark, even grotesque. Nothing hell conjured so far had seemed so horrid. I've seen 1,000 scary films and none have raised a hair on my neck. Hell has done no better. I continued to resist my tormentors. At least I would refuse to comply with their expectations. On rarer opportunities, I attempted to foil them, working in direct opposition to their expectations. Their frustration was my only joy. They halted me one day in a car park behind a brick building. They were dressed as dog catchers or ambulance drivers from after the war. Clad in white coats, they dragged me into an unmarked round white ambulance and held me to a gurney whilst they drove me back to hospital. Nurses assembled on my arrival. All were female of various ages, dressed in white dresses, both short and long-sleeved, all skirted, cropped to just below the knee. Atop each of their heads was a small nurse cap neatly pinned into their hair. Each white cap boasted a colored stripe, perhaps indicating rank or section. The nurses wheeled me into a large common ward. It was cavernous and dark. There was a small amount of ambient light in the room, just enough to see clearly. Yet there was no obvious source of illumination save 2 caged industrial wall fixtures in the left corner from the entrance. The voluminous space was around 20 feet high or more, and broad enough to host more than a dozen beds. All were occupied except one, reserved just for me. A large nurse with red-banded hat wheeled me parallel to it and scolded me to transfer over. When I didn't comply on my own, she shoved me across. She departed curtly without a word, taking the gurney I'd come in on. The beds each were in green-painted wooden cubicles, lined up toe-to-toe and side by side, with foot-high partition in between each patient. On the aisle side of each berth was lowered lip. I rolled over mine and fell limp-legged to the floor. My legs were useless trunks. I guess I wouldn't just be able to walk away. The red-cap nurse was returning from wherever she'd taken the gurney. She saw me on the floor at the same instant as did a thin teal cap. The nurses rushed to me on the floor and helped me back into my berth. I spent the night in that ward. Nurses sharked around in between the banks of patient beds, tending to those who needed. Many patients slept, many stirred. The occasional cough or fit of coughs reverberated from various parts of the room. No one spoke. I did not sleep. When morning came, nurses returned with my gurney. Redcap sneered at me.
"Come on,"
she barked. "Come where?"
"The chief of medicine. She'll want to review your case well. She won't want to. Honestly, I think she's going to be pissed you're wasting her time. Do you even want to get better?"
And there the Sophia sat aloft, atop the mezzanine of the hospital atrium. She'd more substance to her form than she had in the courtroom before. There she had shape only whilst I looked away. Here, the opposite was true. She seemed to have only substance when I looked directly at her. She was pale as before, regal as before, beautiful as before. An elaborate black frock hung from her ashen shoulders, her arms thin as they were colorless. Two thin, pale black lips pulled to the left in a cynical grin. To her left, the demiurge stood proudly smiling. His arms were folded neatly in front of his chest. They both glared at me as I was brought into the room. They did not move except to turn their heads to track my entrance. The nurses brought my gurney to a rest at the atrium floor beneath her feet. The Sophia spoke. "Here we behold again this ungrateful wretch." She spoke directly to me, in sounds I could clearly understand, and in a language which I could comprehend. Her voice was that of a queen, or perhaps a goddess, and she spoke with the authority exemplary of those stations. Her tone was one less maternal and more matriarchal. Her voice issued from the room itself, from every direction, though did not perfectly sync with the movement of that black mouth. In fact, even though she was more opaque than before, everything about her seemed just a sliver of a second out of phase with time, like a glitched-out hologram in a space opera. "Why then, worm, have they brought you here to molest me for a second time? How is it that you have not already been returned to me, a butchered lamb?" She sniffed at me. "What could you possibly say that I would deign to hear?" "I didn't ask to be here, if this is what I can expect from you and yours. If there's no me to go back to, then let me go. I'd rather not exist at all than be here with you." "Why would you ever be anywhere other than exactly where I want you to be? If you were of any utility to me, do you not think you would be in my employ? If I wanted you gone, do you not think I would have done away with you? How arrogant. I knew you before I made you, you insignificant speck. How could I have misplaced you? You have been in my parlor all along." She leaned her head toward the beast, but kept her eye fixed on me. What would we do with it? The demiurge shifted weight from his left foot to his right. Arms still crossed, he kept his face to me.
"He is insolent. He lacks the forcefulness to join us, and the reverence for worship. There is only one way yet he may earn your clemency."
He raised his gaze just above me, calling to an orderly behind. He spoke with force.
"Call in the witness."
My father's sister, my own dear aunt, shuffled into the front of the room. She held in her hand the hand of her eldest grandson, who walked beside her, as young as he had been when I had known him in life. He released himself from her grasp and crossed the tile toward me. Without a word, he climbed over the tendrils at my feet and onto my empty lap. He curled up on his left side and leaned against my chest. I wrapped my arm to cradle him, a mix of sorrow and joy. "He is ours," she sneered. "So is she, so are you, as are everyone you have ever known. I placed you in this world. I've placed this world around you. It is I and I alone who will determine your place within it. I will do with you as I please. I will do with them as I please. You can do nothing that will alter my power over you." I felt the strain of the scornful expression on my face as I looked back on hers. Perhaps there was a way after all for her to force my hand. But to what capacity would she seek to force me? Would I be forced to submit to service or worship or worse? And what could be worse than death had been so far? I shuddered to think. You will lay prostrate before me and beg for forgiveness. We may devour them both at any time, at my whim. But I promise you this, you will give your love to me, or their suffering will be so much worse than yours. And when you deny me again, rest assured, I have everyone you have ever loved. And they are all exactly where I can find them. It occurred to me then that there was something less than absolute in her words. There was a tiny crack in the argument which I had so far overlooked. She was talking. That implies the potential for concourse, therefore the possibility to retort. It further occurred to me that her order for my submission indicated that my cooperation would be necessary in order for her to accept my surrender. She needed me to say yes. I looked down at the floor. I cradled my dear young cousin in my arms. I looked at my aunt and she looked back blankly. Finally, it occurred to me to ask the most fundamental question I had more or less ignored up until that moment. I asked myself how much of this was real. Was she or he, Sophia, Demiurge, the atrium around us? Was I? I felt a squirming on my lap. My eyes and hands met the source of this disturbance at the same time. Where my cousin's legs had been before, a bluish-gray tail slithered below him, extending from the bottom of his body like a demonic merboy. He didn't look up, but I felt him trembling in my embrace. My expression dropped from scorn to a placid calm. I wore the stoic face of resolve as I looked back up at the Sophia. She smiled at me with her sultry black mouth, raising her eyebrows and face upward. She was ready to receive my proclamation of love. You need me to submit to you. I was calm. You have promised to punish me in the most horrible way. My voice was warm. So, I have a choice. Her face and smile both fell.
A choice not without consequence.
But a choice just the same. I spoke loudly but held the resolve on my face. And if you need me to submit, then you need them to as well. If they're even real to begin with. I promise you this, if you touch one hair on that boy's head, or cause him suffering in any way, you can guarantee you'll get nothing from me. The noise was violent, almost chaotic. At the heart of it was a sound I can only describe as a scream. It was the antithesis of the laughter I heard from the Sophia in her courtroom before. This was rage. The entire atrium shook with the sound. The walls and floor separated from each other and drifted off separately into a brilliant, pale, pinkish light. A moment of darkness, and then trees. I was above a quaint intersection in what seemed to be a light residential area. Beside me, small, brightly colored birds sang to one another in the warm afternoon sunlight. Below, happy people walked or cycled down the way. Murmurs of pleasant conversation rose from the street. I was calm. The scene held for a moment and then turned. First, the saturation of color increased at least 100-fold. At the same time, everything in my field of view fell out of focus. My vision was filled instead with an abstract splatter of vivid hues. The colors formed a sort of mosaic of stained glass, scrolled from the bottom of my sight upward, like the crawl at the end of a film. The images were mostly of trees, buildings, and scenes from throughout my Stygian nightmare. There, near the end of the scrolling technicolor, a blue Sophia sat, curled into a fetal pose, wearing the face of defeat. There was no music, but at the bottom of the crawl the voices faded away. I felt movement below me, but soon rather realized it was within me. I sat helpless as I lost my bowel. My eyes were still closed. Light poured through my shuttered lids, casting a reddish glow against my retinas. Hospital machines hummed and beeped around me. I heard a male voice.
Nick, are you awake?
The tube was in. I couldn't reply.
Do you know who we are?
I opened my eyes.
Do you know where you are?
I nodded. The aunt that I had just seen was sat near my left side, right where she'd been standing before.
I'm really glad you're finally awake. You've got a visitor. Do you know what day it is?
I grunted, but my voice was muted by my tube, like a striker thudding against a cloth inside its bell. Don't try to talk yet. We've had to intubate you for surgery. Hang on, I'll get the doctor and see if it's safe to get the tube out. The doctor came in. He poked at me a bit and then gave a thumb up to allow my extubation. The nurse came back. Once she'd finished easing the tube out of my throat, she gave me a sponge to moisten my mouth. I croaked to my aunt, asking if my cousin was okay. She seemed confused, but assured me he was when she saw him the day before. I turned to the nurse who was disposing of my tube and clearing up the remnants. In the next moments I'd report that I'd shat myself and asked what day it was. The nurse helped get me cleaned up. She said it was 9th October. I had been asleep for just over 9 days. It had been only 9 days. Months, years, maybe eons had gone by. It had only been 9 days. Finally, this is the part of the film where it ends. It is the top still spinning. The narrator reaching out to take Marla by the hand. Rosemary approaching Adrian's crib with reluctant affection. The audience are silent. Their minds are turning, churning, trying to form the questions creeping into them. Was it a dream? If it wasn't, what would the implications be? If it paints a picture of what lies beyond the veil of death, then how would we proceed? Let's just agree to this for now, that it was a dream, and now I am awake, and I am learning to sleep again. stride boldly into your darkest dreams. See the monsters there for what they truly are. Dreams. And dreams can only harm us if we let them.